Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this month's RSA Webinar. My name is Dr. Meredith Doig. I'm President of the Rationalist Society, which is Australia's oldest free thought group. And before we begin tonight's webinar, I'd like to invite you to join with us in acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connections to land and to sea and to community. So tonight, fantastic turn up, and it's a real pleasure to have with us one of the very few journalists in Australia to take seriously the idea that Australia is meant to be a secular state with genuine separation between church and state, and no privileged status given to any one religion, but possibly is not quite there yet. And that journalist is David Hardaker. Welcome, David.
Hello, thank you.
A little bit about David's background, and then we'll get into a conversation about his latest book. So David, of course, is a veteran and very well-known journalist around Australia, a Walkley Award winner, no less. And he's worked at Crikey, the ABC, Four Corners, 7:30, Foreign Correspondent. I could go on, Foreign Correspondent. AM, PM, and now, David, I understand that you are a senior story producer at Channel 9's Under Investigation program.
Correct, Meredith. This is true.
I never watched Channel 9, but nevertheless, might do it. Just
I'm not offended. It's okay.
But anyway, of course, of the greatest interest to us here at the Rationalist Society is your latest book called Mine is the Kingdom.
Thank you.
Rise and Fall of Brian Houston and the Hillsong Church. And in this book, you chart the rise and fall of Brian and the Hillsong Church, but also in parallel, the rise and fall of our much-loved former Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. So, again, in the book, what you chart is the idea that just a few years ago, both of these men, Brian Houston, Scott Morrison, were really at the height of their power, influence, and powers, so to speak.
Yes.
And then something happened. So would you like to begin by just trying to explain to us in your own words and through the journey that you went through to investigate Hillsong, what do you think happened? Why the fall after such a spectacular rise these men?
Well, thank you very much for the generous introduction. And I would just say off the top that my book began as an exploration of Hillsong, the Hillsong phenomenon. But then it occurred to me that you just can't understand the Hillsong phenomenon without also understanding the rise of Scott Morrison, and probably even more so vice versa. You can't understand Scott Morrison without understanding Hillsong and Pentecostalism. So that became the book title and cover is slightly misleading, as you've alluded to. You know, there's a big picture of Brian Houston, and it says it's all about the rise and fall of Hillsong Church, but probably about a third of it is the entwined lives of these two characters who really did get to the very top of their respective fields. And as you said, in 2019 was probably that they were at the height of their powers. COVID came along shortly after that, so it kind of curtailed the public, I think, recognition of that. But it was crystallized in a meeting in 2019, halfway through the year. Hillsong has its annual conference, and they kick off with, in this instance, the newly elected recently elected Prime Minister Scott Morrison. So you have the Prime Minister on stage with Brian Houston, and it kind of fulfilled both of their destinies, I think. So your question about how they both fell at the same time is interesting. Look, in Brian Houston's case, his past caught up with him, a past where he had actually transgressed morally in a way which really offended particularly young women in the church, but not only young women, but those who have real Christian belief. And it emerged that actually his sins, if we can call them that, weren't criminal, but they were moral, and they involved, his kind of not behaving appropriately with women. And so they have been covered up actually respectively for 3 and 10 years at a time for both. So these secrets started to emerge at the end around about year 2022, early 2022. At the same time, it became really apparent that the Morrison Roadshow was falling apart, that whatever magic he possessed had well and truly deserted him, and that the people had really tumbled in a way to the truth of who he was. Now, if I could say the common denominator, we can come back to it, but there is a common denominator here, which is that both, I think, really were revealed as being right out of their time with respect to gender equality, and that was because the Hillsong model really is built on the primacy of males, and that really that caught up with Brian, and and was he faced an insurrection from younger women, and of course I think we all know Scott Morrison's peculiar ability to misunderstand gender roles. So that was the symmetry of the two.
Interesting. One of the things that I'm always curious about, and I don't know, and you may have the evidence, is to what extent has the Pentecostal church in Australia been influenced by the Pentecostalism or evangelical movements in the United States?
Yeah. The short answer is heavily, and that is because of the particular influence of the Houston family, which with both Brian Houston and his father Frank had borrowed heavily from the showbiz aspects of US evangelism, and also the propensity to make a lot of money out of it. So they became really dominant players within the Pentecostal movement of Australia, but they had their enemies. It's not like they were universally loved. However, the politics within the Pentecostal Christian movement is such that if you're able to deliver money, influence, and bums on seats in an age of declining interest in religion, well, you are, all power to you. So the Houston model became really dominant in Australian Pentecostalism. The whole idea of the mega church, music, which attracted a younger demographic, the promise that you could be both a true believer and also become wealthy because of being a true believer, really rang big bells in an aspirational suburban class of Australia. So those two, that confluence of factors made it really hard for those who opposed the Houstons in the Pentecostal movement to really have any voice. So they gained political power that way within their Christian religion.
The people who opposed him, were they Australians or Americans
Yes.
or both?
No, they were Australians, and they were, Pentecostalism, had been known as the Assemblies of God movement, and it was a very, very conservative movement where, even Brian Houston, I think, reflected that in his younger days, he didn't want to go to the cinema on Sunday in case, God observed him in there having a good time on a Sunday. I mean, look how far that moved, right? From that kind of conservatism, in dress and in social behaviour, and certainly in, sort of things like, sexual and social relationships. But it just moved dramatically with the years.
So the more conservatives
Yeah,
from the Assemblies of God era
yeah,
were
yeah.
opposed to this sort of modernization.
Well, the modernisation, well, but also I think what became a really brazen marrying of faith and money. So that's, the so-called prosperity gospel. So the prosperity gospel, which says that if you give to God and God's greatness, then God will bless you in return, manifold many times. I mean, it's in the early days of Pentecostalism or Assemblies of God, the God's magnificence was sort of evident in the doing of miracles. And really kind of extraordinary things happening unbidden to people in the 1920s, 30s, etc. But then that kind of translated into extraordinary gift, extraordinary bounty of wealth. And in the latter years of Hillsong, you could read personal testimonials of how, I was a loser. I went to Hillsong. I believed in God. I gave money. Now I own 7 investment properties, and that equation of God's blessing to material wealth became quite explicit, and that was offensive and is offensive to a fair proportion of pastors in that movement.
Right.
Mm.
Just before we go on, can
Yeah.
I just invite anybody who is with us tonight, if you have a particular question that you'd like to put to David, please just type it into the chat box, and we'll see if we can get around to those. And thank you for those who have already sent in some questions, and I'll get through as many of those as we can. But David, just coming back to your book, which I'd encourage everybody to have a look at. It's available in all good bookstores, as they say.
That's right. And online.
And online, yes. What was it that prompted you to actually pull this book together? But this was preceded, of course, by a series of very in-depth investigative articles that you did
that's
for Nike.
right.
So what prompted the original interest?
Yeah. Okay. I had to actually remind myself this evening of what it was, because it's now going back probably 3 years or 4 years that I started to dive deep into Hillsong. Look, it all started because of the phenomenon of QAnon. Oddly enough, so the QAnon conspiracy theory, which was promulgated out of the Trump uh, gang, probably in the United States, and picked up in Australia by a family friend of the Morrisons, a man called Tim Stewart, was sort of the major proponent of the QAnon conspiracy theory in Australia. So, the some of us dug deep into that story. And when you dig deep into that story, you see there's this idea of an awakening and a storm coming and an end of days feel about it. A sense that Satan is amongst us, which is a very strong feeling in Pentecostalism. Now, there's a kind of a rather close relationship between the Morrisons and the Stewart family, which you might say is a little unusual, almost, with this guy Tim Stewart having gone very much down a rabbit hole and being a proponent of this big conspiracy theory. So one of the great things about Crikey is that when you with a small digital outlet like that, you can do a story, and people will respond directly to you and give you more information. And in that case, it was a member. I think I'm okay to say this. A member of the Stewart family was had quite some information about the background between the Morrisons and this guy who's promoting QAnon. So that is itself interesting. And so from there, I made a little bit of note here, but I gained some more information about Scott Morrison's own very strong Christian background, which I had not been aware of, believe it or not. So that led to the discovery, which I think was really quite seriously important, that as a university student, Scott Morrison had written a thesis on how to expand the influence of the Christian Brethren in Australia. So, that's
Is
really,
that the same as the exclusive brethren or
well,
different?
look, good question. And no, there's the open brethren and the exclusive brethren. I actually need to clarify that. I think it's the open brethren. I
Right.
think it's the open brethren because it's the idea that they could attract members of the public to go to them, whereas the exclusive brethren, you're pretty much bound within a kind of a family setting almost. So that to me was an amazing bit of information that as a 21-year-old, Scott Morrison, who we knew was a Christian, but such a Christian that at university he would devote his time to writing about expanding the reach of this religion, which is, it's a pretty marginal activity for a university student, let's be honest. So that, it marked him out as somebody really, extraordinary to me. Having published that, then again, there's this lovely kind of steamroll, not steamroll, snowball effect of more information coming. So one of the pastors who was very concerned about uh, the rights and wrongs of the rise of the Houstons and who was really opposed to them pointed me to an extraordinary uh, talk which Scott Morrison, as Prime Minister, gave to a meeting of the Australian Christian churches on the Gold Coast. So the Australian Christian churches being the umbrella group for Pentecostalism in Australia. Brian Houston was in the audience. It was all the bigwigs of Pentecostalism gathered in the Gold Coast. It was during the time of COVID, and Morrison had been under particular pressure because of his criticism of his response to COVID. He found time to take a break and go and speak to this group, and that was helpfully somebody recorded it. Helpfully somebody posted it online, and that I think remains for me the most revealing snapshot of Scott Morrison's beliefs and the depth of his beliefs and the absolute comfort that he feels in the company of other Pentecostal people. So that it was there also that you see Scott Morrison speaking what I came to learn to be this language called Christianese, which makes perfect sense to those who are steeped in the Christian faith, but hardly any sense to others. So somebody had to translate that for me. Now that then again the snowball effect. It led to me investigating the whole Hillsong phenomenon, really, from that. So it really sort of started reverse from Scott Morrison himself. And then, when you look at the Hillsong phenomenon, I do think that what was missing was a thorough, disciplined investigation into its finances.
And we might come back to that.
Yeah, most
You
definitely.
mentioned that there was an insider who
Yeah,
gave you initially some information about Tim
yeah,
Scott and his family and their connection with the Morrisons.
yeah.
And I understand that there were other insiders from Hillsong
Mm,
who then gave you
correct.
details and insights into Hillsong. So, and they were young women
They were.
mostly. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And so, um, as we, crikey, myself, published more and more stories about Hillsong and its finances and and the hypocrisy of its actions, um, a, a couple of young women got in touch with me, and they uh, were and remain anonymous. So look, this was um, a pretty strong feeling from that they were telling me about, that they felt that look, it really the discontent within Hillsong was really sparked by what happened to a visiting young student from America, a female who suffered a very an unfortunate incident at a Hillsong party where a Hillsong boy lunged at her in a drunken state. And it was, he eventually was charged with indecent assault. Now, but it was very, very hard for this young woman to get a form of justice from Hillsong. And her cause became a cause célèbre within the Hillsong movement, really quite quietly, but very, very strongly. Her name is Anna Crenshaw. The story has become known since. But there were young women watching what happened to Anna Crenshaw who could identify very strongly with it, that they could see a double standard in how people were treated. If you were part of the Houston gang of old mates, you would be probably get a different form of justice to if you weren't part. And clearly the church had not caught up with modern things like diversity. Its board had, I think, for most of the time, one woman on it and 10 men, something like that. It had 20 charities, all of whom had boards of directors, again, which were 95% male. So the idea of being responsive to, the representative, to those who are actually in the congregation, it simply wasn't. And so they felt that not only was there an injustice, but that Hillsong, and particularly Brian Houston, was exhibiting signs of, you would say, abusing Christianity. So these
Abusing Christianity, not
well,
abusing the young women?
In the worship of money, the pure,
Right.
purely the shows of material wealth. The ostentatious shows, really, the Houstons driving Audis, top of the line Audis, immaculately dressed, spending lots of money, which in fact is money which is given sacrificially from congregants. There is tithing in Pentecostal church and in Hillsong. That is 10% of your gross income you should pay. So for for some people that kind of worked quite well, but then there's a whole lot of people who were young women that I was talking to who came to me who were attracted to the idea of Hillsong because they wanted to do good in the world, and
But they
good.
were
They would,
attracted to the ideals of
yes,
Hillsong.
and I think genuine Christians,
Hmm.
and I think who I wouldn't argue with that. Maybe some might, but I think the ideas of what they considered was the good parts of Jesus that's what attracted them. They felt that, and it certainly was a lure to young people that here was a church which was prepared to sort of get out there and get into Africa, get into the developing world and try to help lives. And it was a lot more, I think it would seem a lot more responsive than the so-called purple religions, like the Catholics and the Anglicans. So they felt that this was a place to do good, and it was a place where they felt understood and not marginalized. So they were really attracted to it and then felt betrayed. They felt betrayed by what the church was doing. They felt in the name of Christianity, and they felt betrayed that there were double standards that weren't Christian inside the church. And, look, it was just I mean, I know I've called it the Me Too movement. It's not. I mean, but the idea of, young women feeling abused really by this system. And
And betrayed.
eh?
And betrayed.
But betrayed, absolutely, absolutely. So, it was a really big deal for them to pass information over, very, very big. And you know, Brian always made out that to work with the media was to sort of be doing the work of Satan. Because if the media is critical, it's what's the devil's work? Trying to get in the way of the spread of Christianity.
So
So
there's two things I
yeah,
want to follow up here,
yeah,
David. One is that, and I want to read a quote
uh-huh,
because there seems to be, you wrestle with the parallel
mm,
between Scott Morrison and Brian Houston. So
yeah,
the quote that I want to read is this. You say, the real question is not whether or not Morrison acted like a Christian in government. It's
yeah,
whether or not his actions were influenced by the model of
yeah,
Pentecostal Christianity promoted by Houston
yeah,
and Hillsong.
yeah,
So it's not that, or did you come to the conclusion that Morrison was not necessarily trying to impose Pentecostal Christianity on Australia, but he saw the successful business model of Hillsong and sort of ran his government a bit like that?
Well, in a way, yes. So the reason I tried to make that distinction between Christianity and Hillsong style Christianity is because, look, I mean, we might get to this a bit later in more detail, but there is a massive resistance, particularly amongst the political commentariat, to accept the idea that religion might play a role in politics, and specifically Scott Morrison's politics. So, that was, and people would say, well, if he was really a Christian, he wouldn't have done the very severe refugee work that he did as immigration minister. Why would he do robo-debt? What I mean, these aren't Christian actions. No, well, no, they're not. But they, I think, arguably are the actions of this particular strand of Christianity. Now,
Which is very judgmental. Is that what you're suggesting?
no, it's there's a strand in Pentecostalism, and particularly in the Hillsong style, which says that if you are not prospering, it is because you don't believe enough in God. Right? So the problem isn't the system, the problem is your lack of faith. And so if you aren't a person of God, you kind of deserve what's coming to you.
Which is
Now,
along the lines, I think, because I've done a bit of reading about
yeah,
characteristics of cults.
yeah.
To what extent would you say, from now what you understand
Yeah.
about Pentecostalism and Hillsong, to what extent would you say that it is similar to a cult?
Well, it is similar. It's sort of dangerous territory, I think,
Mm.
because I think when people think cults, they think of the people of Jonestown who took the Kool-Aid and killed themselves, or some really cruel practices. But I think this actually ties up with really what I was trying to get to with what Morrison, I think, borrowed from the Pentecostal model of Christianity, and that is, in short, the leader is God anointed, and therefore whatever they say is pretty much inarguable. And so this is the foundation of the Houston model of the business model of their Pentecostalism, which they introduced to Australia. And in that model, the senior pastor is has absolute primacy and is their word is final, and so there's nothing democratic about it in a way. Yeah, you could call them, they're bulldozers like Morrison. Yeah, it's just the bulldozer model. So I think that it became really evident when Morrison was elected in 2019, and he talked about a miracle, the miracle election, and under that it means God intervened, God anointed him, and that powered him up. And and I think that it's proven even more so since he saw that that was accountable not so much to the electorate or parliament or secular forms of accountability. He saw himself as being accountable to God, and he saw himself as doing God's work.
I'd like to, before we go on with our questions, I'd like to make sure that I draw on some of the questions that
Yeah,
people have brought in previously.
yeah,
So uh, let me go through some of those. And we've touched on some of the content of
yeah.
those questions, but let me just go through some others. Adrian McLean from New South Wales says or asks, apart from the Hillsongs, are there other religious sects, particularly the Exclusive Brethren, that may be flying under the radar but are influential and dangerous?
So,
What's your view?
so I think that's a really interesting question, and the question of them being influential. I mean, you're calling it a sect, but I suppose you could say the Catholic Church had been massively influential, right? So there's mainstream influence through, particularly when you had a guy like Scott Morrison there. Tony Abbott. But on that sort of that smaller group stuff, I think what is a defining feature of the Hillsong phenomenon and Pentecostalism is what is known in the business as the Seven Mountains Mandate, which is this sort of seven loci of power, where Christians should should be present and wield influence in order to change the society. So this idea of there being seven mountains of influence is very strong in America, and certainly Brian Houston picked that up in Australia, and he spoke about it. And they include politics, they include education, business, the arts, sport. I'm going to run out of the. I think.
Well, I think one of the others, interestingly enough, is other religions.
And other religions, yeah. So that's right, in religion, to influence religion itself. That's right. So,
are you aware then of Pentecostals in other spheres of influence, in business, for example, or in education or in the arts?
look, I can't claim to know a whole lot, spread across those seven mountains, but certainly, the influence of having a Pentecostal believer in the lodge was a very big victory, I think, for Brian Houston and Hillsong.
Maybe, David, that would be your next book, your next investigation.
Yeah, well, bearing in
Check out
mind,
the other
check out
six
the other ones. That's right.
mountains. Let me go to a question by Julia Mizuno from Queensland, who says, the views of religious bodies and LGBTI groups are broadly relayed in the media in relation to religious discrimination laws.
Yeah.
And including the new version of the religious discrimination bill that Labor is putting up. But her question is, why doesn't the media give a voice to the rapidly growing non-religious demographic who are also affected?
Look, good question. Because I think that the religions are organised, and they're really good at lobbying, and they're really good at and they're very practiced at influencing the public debate, and they do exist as a set developed entity, and they have structures to do this. That's why. So I think the media, with the media, that often works on the principle of the you respond to the noisiest wheel or something,
Squeaky wheel.
whatever. You know what I mean? So it's because they're the people who are making the noise that they get taken notice of. I think. I mean, the religions have been really great at influencing government policy.
And they've had decades of accumulating tithes, so they have finances.
Yeah. Look, that's right. But and probably if we get to it, I mean, nothing probably illustrates this better than the charities laws.
Well, I wanted to come to that because Tanya Marwood from Western Australia has a question. How can we make religious organisations more transparent and accountable?
Yeah.
And part of that is at least making their finances more transparent and accountable. So do you want to just talk about what you found when you investigated Hillsong and you documented in your book about the financial model for Hillsong?
Yeah, that's right. So the financial model is, it's based on, the charities are at the core. And there's a particular sort of charity called the basic religious charity, which is utterly opaque, really, even to the charities regulator. So this is a particular form of black box where the regulator has very little visibility and very little say. And look, even the regular charities, which aren't sort of basic religious charities, I think a third of all charities, I believe, are religion based. It is the biggest single grouping, followed by education. And there's a ruling which you might be familiar with from the High Court in the early 2000s, which said, look, if you say that your primary purpose of an activity is for the advancement of religion, then fine, you are allowed to have religious sort of charitable status and tax deductibility. And so, this has really helped propel Hillsong's finances. They made they brought in tens and tens of millions of dollars through their music. It comes in through a charity, it's not taxed. And that's a pretty major way to advance your cause. So, this...
You'd be aware, however, that the Productivity Commission is reviewing charities law, and there may be some changes to the basic religious charities category.
I guess watch this space, because in 2018 there was a review of how the Charities Act was functioning, and this independent review recommended that the basic religious charity be, I think, abolished, certainly regulated much better than it is. So those recommendations happened to land in the government's lap just when Scott Morrison had become Prime Minister. And so, and anyway, before that, he'd been treasurer, and all this falls under the treasury portfolio. So the idea that Morrison might help, abolish the very engine, the engine room of Hillsong was just fanciful, really. But I think that more broadly speaking, both the major parties have problems in closing loopholes in charities laws that religions, not just Hillsong, benefit from. They just don't want to offend the religious lobby, the religious groups.
Well, at the RSA, we've commissioned some really in-depth analysis of the data around Australians and religiosity.
Yeah.
And it became very clear when you read the 5 volumes that we've published that actually it's a bit like the tail wagging the dog. That is the Pentecostal or the more evangelical form of Christianity, which is influencing, wagging the mainstream Christian body in Australia. And for the most part, ordinary Christians are a pretty progressive lot. They're in favour of voluntary assisted dying. They're in favour of equal marriage.
Quite right.
They're in favour of action on climate change and so on.
Right.
But it's this very active and persuasive, you have to say, minority who put in the time and the effort to influence the public policy.
Totally. Yeah, that's right. The leadership doesn't reflect the body of members often, I think, in these things.
But to what extent do you think, because presumably you've spoken to a lot of MPs and politicians about this, and it does seem that they're very nervous about offending the so-called religious lobby, but we know that the vast majority of Christians are fairly progressive, so they wouldn't be offended if they took action to promote the mainstream Christianity, but they seem not to be able to do that either. Do you have any insight into why?
Well, I just think they think it's a fight and it's not worth having. They don't want to pick on that when there's a whole lot of other things to do. So I think it almost comes down to that. And I mean, and it can come down particularly to, say, the composition of the decision-making body we call Parliament. If the government doesn't have a majority in the Senate, are those senators, subject or vulnerable to lobbying? And they may be. They may just be. And that's the case. When the charities regulator was being established in 2012, some of these exceptions and loopholes were directly lobbied for by there were minority senators who were vulnerable to that lobbying, and they were decisive. So often it can just come down to small numbers, I think,
I
as
know
well.
that Andrew Wilkie, one of the independents, was
Yeah,
useful in tabling in Parliament a whole lot of the quite damning information about Hillsong. But do you think in the future, now that there are some more independents in Parliament, that there is maybe a little bit more optimism about these things, seeing the sunlight, the disinfectant of sunlight?
I, I don't know. I think again it can come down to key members within major parties and even trade-offs within the party. And is there a Catholic influence in the Labor Party, for example, which wants to, for its slice of the pie or for a payoff for other things? Okay, we let them have that. I think that's the level that it operates on. So I think that, and I think you saw with the assisted dying debate that for a long, 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 long time, the will of the parliament did not reflect the will of the people. But that's because of really, really good lobbying and by the organised religions who knew the pressure points within parties. So I think they were able to accumulate much more influence within that body of parliamentarians than they could in the general community. And I think that probably, as we know, the assisted dying legislation has somewhat changed that. But I think it's not easy. It's not easy at all. Mm.
Well, as somebody who was on the board of Dying with Dignity Victoria, I'm very
Yeah.
aware that it was a 30-year fight.
Yes.
Mm.
Yes. With
Um,
something I happen to know a little bit about. I worked with Andrew on it.
all right.
Yeah.
Let's change the subject just a little
Yeah.
bit, direction a little bit. Joan Ross from the ACT says this: I understand that the Hillsong Church was expanding in other countries, including the USA and
Yes.
Ireland.
Yes.
Ireland.
I,
I
I
thought they were
didn't
using
know about
strong
that.
tactics to take over small independent
Yep.
congregations.
Yeah.
Are
Well, that
you
happened
aware of
in.
this?
Look, the Ireland example I didn't know about, but it was about 10 years ago, really. Hillsong, its center of power went to America. It realized that there's there's a big market over in the United States, and Brian Houston had earned a name for himself, as the Aussie upstart, the charming Aussie kind of, even though he's from New Zealand originally, but they kind of loved him, for being Australian. I mean, Brian Houston found his way into the White House in a meeting with Donald Trump. He ended up moving easily with the evangelical Pentecostal leaders of America, and and that whole Republican mashup. So that they long ago moved the center of power to, well, New York, in fact, where it all ultimately collapsed. But
And David, can I just say, I've heard you interviewed on a
yeah,
podcast where you said that during the course of investigating,
yeah,
gathering your information for the
yeah,
book, you had to watch a lot of Brian Houston's
I did,
sermons,
I
and
did.
that you actually found him very appealing.
I do. I find him really engaging, and I think he's got a kind of a laconic thing about himself. He's self-deprecating. He makes fun of his bald spot. He makes fun of his some explosive peas, and when he's preaching. And I think that that's part of his charm. I mean, people who know him will say that they find him in some sense as a vulnerable person. They kind of like him, like that vulnerability about him. And I think yes, I do. I mean, look, he couldn't be so successful if he wasn't a great, engaging showman, which because that's what he is. He and his dad, they're a showbiz family. So yeah, he's charming, and all that sort of stuff.
Is there any likelihood of a third generation
Well,
the
there is a third
Houstons?
generation, but the family business is, just kind of crashed for them, and I don't really see them coming back. But that is the other thing to know about these mega churches; they're family businesses. and they don't necessarily promote people, say, on merit. They're promoting people on family ties, or have done anyway.
And the guy who's now taken over as the senior pastor, is it Phil Dooley?
Yes.
Yeah. So he has said, I can't see where that he wants. Oh,
A
he's
healthy
talked about
church.
creating a healthy
Yeah.
Hillsong. How do you think
Yes.
that's going?
Yeah. Well, I think that, this is, I don't know the answer to that question. I think it's sort of the $64 question or $1 million question or whatever it is. Because as I say, the Hillsong is so identified with the Houstons, that charismatic character of Brian Houston. And other churches are similarly identified with the central character. And whether or not, it can survive as a more regular Christian church, I don't know. There's this, I think a Hillsong service had a particular engaging character to it, with this combination of music and oratory and just this sort of build of emotion and energy, and you get carried along in a wave. And in this, when you're in this wave, you're pledging money, you're giving a donation, you're signing up for all sorts of things, and your belief just escalates. And the really strong networks and communities.
Here's something that just occurred to me. Did you get any sense of how long people stayed in Hillsong? Because
Um,
you mentioned there the
yeah,
emotional high
yeah,
they can get.
yeah.
Did they always get that emotional high, or is it a little bit like an addiction where you have to get higher and higher and higher, and if not, maybe you crash?
Well, no, I think the difficulty for some people was that, I mean, some people. I've spoken to people who've stuck by Hillsong despite the travails, and they say, "Look, I was saved. Hillsong saved me. My life was a mess, and it saved me, so I'm going to stick with it." And so I think it's really very, very difficult to leave. And that's what the young women who I was talking to. I mean, there's a group of not just young women, but dedicated souls who have been trying to reform Hillsong for a long time, and they're passionate. They're passionate about it, and because they believe in their Christianity, good on them. And they want it to be right. But the difficulty of actually leaving is really, really, it's very hard. Because it's punitive. You kind of leave an entire community and entire friendship groups, and you get shunned, and it's really hard.
Yeah.
It's what happened to Natalie Moses, who brought forward a claim against Hillsong in the federal court for wrongful dismissal, I believe, and she claimed whistleblower status. And she had tried to bring forward things that were wrong, and she paid a price.
I have amongst my friends people who are ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, and
Okay.
the shunning,
Yeah.
um, it sounds like it's, well, people just won't talk to you anymore, but it appears to be much more severe in
Yeah.
its emotional impact,
Totally.
for people when your whole life is bound up with something
Yes.
and your family, and
Correct.
then they are deliberately cut off.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It's really, and it's also I think someone mentioned before, the exclusive brethren, the same thing. And it's
and some other
severs.
religions as well.
Yes, indeed, and severs familial relationships. I mean,
Mm.
it's really, really hard. So they're brave people who walk out.
Mm.
Very.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, David, you have some harsh words to say about some of your fellow journalists,
Well,
and
I do.
particularly the Canberra Press Gallery. Do you
Yeah.
want to sort of
Well,
say
well,
a bit
well.
about that?
Look, I do, because I think, as alluded to, at the top of our conversation, there's been this very strong taboo about questioning a prime minister's religion, and that was probably just fine when you had John Howard and even Tony Abbott, Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard as an atheist, Malcolm Turnbull, kind of Catholic light, whatever, but not many. Morrison is a different kettle of fish. He behaved very differently. He almost invited, I think, scrutiny of his religious beliefs and its influence on him, because he appeared in a Pentecostal church, hands raised with the cameras. He has spoken now at length, really, about the role of Christianity in his life. He not many former prime ministers will refer to Satan and the evil one being, amongst us. In fact, I can't think of any. So, look, what I think really the final proof to me was that when Scott Morrison and his grab for power via the 5 ministries, which he did secretly, by and large. When that emerged, the entire political class was shocked, aghast, and couldn't comprehend what had happened. Now, so this to me is a group of people whose entire reason for being and living in Canberra and being in proximity to power is to actually know what's going on. But they were as dumbfounded as anybody as to what Morrison had done. So they missed the story. That's the short and not necessarily harsh judgment, but they did. And even since have refused really to entertain the idea that Scott Morrison's beliefs influenced his
Is that right?
politics.
Even now, they
Even now,
don't recognise the strength and
not at
the
all.
influence
Not at all. I
of
mean,
his
that's right.
beliefs.
And, we sort of touched on briefly earlier these sort of, the speaking of Christianese and the code words, miracle. Now, when Morrison won the 2019 election, he called it a miracle. A lot of people thought, well, it was like, gee, wow, couldn't believe it. What a lucky win sort of thing. But actually, it was, he was talking about divine intervention. He was talking about divine intervention. Now, I've spoken to journalists in recent times about that, and they go, oh, yeah, well, yeah, I didn't know he meant divine intervention. Now I see it a bit. Now I see it, but, well, so. But the so of that, I mean, if we had time, I do want to briefly tell you about, the greatest example of, I think, Scott Morrison's, Christianese speaking in code. He has told the story many times about the birth of the Morrison's first child using IVF. And, after many years of no success, his wife, Jenny, became pregnant and gave birth to Abby on the 7th of July, 2007. Now, that is 7th day of the 7th month, the 7th year. And now to a Christian, particularly Pentecostal ear, that is, oh my God, you are blessed by God. You are blessed by God. And Morrison has played that up. And here it goes, 7 sevens, it's a week of 7, 7 sevens are 49. Pentecostal means the 50th day, it's one after 49. It all adds up. If you know the background. And so, but a kind of an ordinary listener will hear that and go, oh yeah, but a Pentecostal ear will hear and go, yeah, right, you really were chosen by God. And as Morrison's time has moved on, he has given more detail on that story to say that, well, look, Jenny was ready to give birth on the 6th of July. We're saying, come on, we're ready, we're ready, we're ready. And then as it clicked up to midnight and going to the 7th, Scott Morrison says, I realised what was happening. God was waiting for the 7th of 2007. So look, that's fine, but this guy's Prime Minister. I don't want to be disrespectful, but that's this. It's a sort of a belief in magic and numbers and Satanism and not Satanism. The presence of Satan, and, miracles, all this sort of stuff, which is unusual.
But David, we're coming towards the end of
It's
our
regrettable.
time together. Can I just ask you this, or
Yeah,
two things to
yeah.
wrap up?
Mm,
Before you did this investigation,
yeah.
before you really got caught up in working out or inquiring into what was going on here. Were you sort of perhaps like the rest of us, where religion is just not terribly relevant to your daily life?
Oh, totally. I mean, absolutely. In fact, I was so ill-informed, I had to seek, the advice. I mean, I had to learn what these things were, what these biblical phrases meant. One of Scott Morrison's most often used phrases is that he was in power for such a time as this. And this phrase, such a time as this, is a direct biblical reference to something Esther and a time of when the Christians were under threat. But
Yeah.
I had to learn. I had to learn. So, but the more,
And now that you have
yeah,
learned it,
yes.
um, do you find that it's showing up everywhere? That
Well,
now you recognize how religion has become entangled with public policy and
well,
with
yeah.
government?
I do think that that is the case of the Morrison government, and I think there are things that are still unexplored in that. And I think often, I mean, some of the Morrison government decisions might have been explicable by might have other reasons. But when you put it together and you look at the common thread, I think it explains a lot. I mean, I don't see it with Albanese. I mean, I think he does run a secular government. But
Well, having
I think,
said that,
yeah,
maybe we can wrap up on this
yeah,
final question, which sort of looks to the future.
yeah,
That is, um, having gone into this in depth and now sort of
yes.
being able to pull back and have a look at Australian politics over the last 10 years and then looking forward, do you think your journalist colleagues have learned anything from this last 10 years and having a Pentecostal Prime Minister and the phenomenon of Hillsong? And do you think that the public have learned anything, or are we all sort of blissfully ignorant still?
I think there's a fair bit of blissful ignorance still. Yeah, I do. I think it, takes quite a leap to see this as explaining a lot of the actions. But I think that's okay for the general. It's okay. I mean, what it's the general public view. But I think journalists are paid and have a duty to actually, if your system of explaining things breaks down, as it did with trying to understand the five ministries. So if you keep looking for secular reasons and secular explanations and you come up with no answer, you are going to have to really be forced to consider the other answer, which is religious. And a guy like Reverend Tim Costello has no problem in agreeing that Morrison's grab of the five ministries was directly related to the Pentecostal leadership model of God anointed, I will do it, I will take it. Um, and that would be it is kind of self-evidently an irrational explanation, yet it is the most logical explanation.
And so finally,
Yeah.
do you think that in the future Australia will see another Pentecostal or
Well, I mean, I,
similarly evangelistic religious prime minister?
well, why not? I mean, yeah, because I think look, it's really up to the Liberal Party to deal with its problem on this, but it's still there. Victoria, South Australia. You look at Senator Antic,
Alex
Alex
Antic.
Antic. You
Mm.
know, he fostered a Pentecostal section within the group within the South Australian Liberals as a faction. And so, they do exist. And of course, the Pentecostalism as it's practiced in the Hillsong model is really deeply entwined with neoliberalism. It's a religion which itself, I think, prizes entrepreneurism. It prizes, building success measured in numbers, dollars. So the two, I think, there's a strong strand of neoliberalism which is perfectly married with Pentecostalism and vice versa.
Mm.
So that can be that could continue within the Liberal Party. So they've really got to sort that out, or not.
So,
Yeah.
what is it? The price of freedom is everlasting vigilance.
Yeah. Well, I think we normally kind of apply that to wars.
Yeah.
So if that's what we're witnessing, yes.
David, thank you so much for spending this hour with it. It's been absolutely fascinating. Can I just encourage everybody? Actually, we will put in when we send out a link to the video of this session, we'll put a link to where people can buy your book. So we encourage people to buy it. Support David as one of the very few journalists who's prepared to take this stuff seriously. I mean, I know that we at the Rationalist Society have been banging away for a number of years, but let's support people like David. And David, hopefully you can influence some of your younger colleagues to take this stuff seriously as well.
Well, Meredith, thanks ever so much, and I've really enjoyed it. I wish we could talk for another half an hour. I'm starting to get revved up a bit, but it is, when intelligent people kind of don't comprehend different explanations simply because they're different explanations, it's frustrating.
It is.
And it speaks to a form of, I don't know, stupidity, which is really frustrating. So anyway, look.
Well, all power to your arm. Thank you again
Thank
for
your
time, and thank you for writing the book and pulling all this together.
I'm glad I did.
To all of our lovely webinar participants, hope to see you next time. Good night.
Thank you so much. Bye now.